There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. In this episode, I speak with Steve Smith. Steve, or Ardalis as he's known online, is the co-founder and chief architect of NimblePros, a boutique consulting company focused on helping teams write better software faster. Steve's an entrepreneur and software developer with a passion for building quality software. He's published many courses on Pluralsight covering topics like DDD, solid, design patterns, and software architecture. He's a Microsoft MVP, a frequent speaker at developer conferences, an author, and a trainer. He also maintains a number of open source projects, including several NuGet packages with millions of downloads. In this episode, Steve and I are talking about feedback cycles and how shortening them can improve your software. Let's get started. All right, welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Hey, Jay. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for taking the time to have this conversation. Really looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too.
So when I reached out to you and said, hey, I'd love to have you on the podcast, we're talking about software projects are hard. Here's, some ideas about how to make them more successful. I know you have a lot of those ideas. You're sort of an architecture guru, and so we could probably talk for hours about architecture stuff, but I was really interested that when I asked you for what you thought you wanted to talk about in that genre, you said feedback cycles. I love how abstract that is. It's a great engineer answer. And I also think it's so you. So can you tell me a little bit more about when you say feedback cycles, what are you thinking about and what are you talking about?
Yeah, I've seen over my career just the same pattern recurring in our industry of things that used to have a long feedback cycle and a history of failure moving to a shorter feedback cycle and that improving productivity or success rate or whatever. So, you look at the waterfall way of doing software development that, some teams use, some teams still use, and compare that with, many of the iterative or agile approaches with, shorter iterations or sprints or whatever you want to call them. And usually within that iteration, all the things you would do in waterfall of gathering requirements and designing and building and testing and hopefully shipping, you would do inside that iteration. So you're just compressing the time frame down from months or years to a couple of weeks, let's say. And then you see similar things with, builds and integration where, in the 90s, it wasn't unusual for someone on a large team to be the build guy. And that their responsibility was like when it came time to ship at the end of the 6 months or whatever, they would spend however long it took to like put all the pieces together and try and create something they could actually ship. And then we started to have, daily builds, or I think it started with like monthly builds, but, more frequently integrating until eventually, extreme programming comes along and says, let's do that continuously. And continuous integration was born, which is like, the most, the most frequency you can get, right? The tightest feedback cycle you can get.
Mm-hmm. So when you say tightest, what I hear is shorter or faster feedback cycles. Does that seem accurate?
Yeah, for sure.
So what do you think it is at an abstract level? Is it something about human nature, psychology, just systems in general? What do you think it is that makes a shorter or faster cycle tend to work better?
I think it's the presence of unknowns, and that in the future, our ability to predict is very limited. And so when you have a poor ability to predict the future and you need to adjust frequently, longer feedback cycles makes it much more difficult to do that. So, there's metaphors you could think of, like you're driving a car and you're trying to get from Michigan to Ohio, and which one is going to be easier for you when you're driving down the road? Is it that you can touch the steering wheel as often as you want and make tiny adjustments as you go, or that once every 30 seconds you're allowed to adjust the steering wheel? Like which one's going to let you drive faster safely? And it's that kind of thing where you're trying to guide where you're going with your software development and even with your business based
Mm-hmm.
on new information that's coming in constantly, and being able to adjust the steering more often than every 6 months or every 2 weeks is really going to make a difference in whether or not you reach the destination and whether or not you get there safely and successfully.
Yeah, no, I'm sure our audience here is going to hear some agile manifesto in between the lines of that statement. So what you're talking about has a lot to do with agile. Is that true?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, this is I'm not making this stuff up, right? This is standing
Right.
on shoulders of giants all the way down. But manufacturing going to lean and Toyota Production System is all about feedback cycle shortening. 100 years ago, manufacturing would like have a whole set of people whose job was to go buy stuff for that they might need for building things, and they would go and try and get the best deal on the materials. And they'd usually to get a better deal, you'd have to buy more of it. So they'd buy a whole lot of stuff and they'd put it all in warehouses, and then folks would try and build things, and some of it would sell really well and some of it wouldn't, and they hadn't predicted which was which, and so they'd have shortages or they'd have too much stuff in inventory and it was a lot of waste. And then Toyota Production System and lean and just in time come along, and
Yeah.
they say, well, let's not do all that. Let's do a pull system, not a push system, and have tighter feedback cycle of as soon as you run out of something, you place an order for a little bit more of it, instead of trying to predict the future poorly and buying everything for the year in January.
Yeah, exactly. So you and I are both consultants. We meet with clients all the time and work with their teams and see how their teams are organized. So without naming any names, obviously, what are the things you see the most commonly when you're working with your clients where people are not, optimizing their feedback cycles or shortening their feedback cycles? What do you run into all the time that you wish, you could like grab the industry by its lapels and shake it and tell it to do better?
Yeah. One thing I've had a lot of success with some clients is, you hear the same kinds of things from different clients that are experiencing the same pain, right? And one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that you'll hear pain about is deployments. And there's even like this whole meme of like no deploy Fridays and stuff where, people don't want to get called back on the weekend or have to stay up all night Friday because they ship something on a Friday.
Yeah.
And so I've got lots of clients that at either in the past or occasionally still now, but most of them have gotten better. They would be shipping software every 6 to 12 weeks, right? Once or twice a quarter they'd ship, and that's not terrible. That's not like once a year, but it's still not that often. And so I would propose to them, hey, we should do that more often. And when you hear about what's involved with them shipping, this one client in particular, it was like everyone has to get up and be at the office at 3 a.m. so that they can start the deployment process. And then when things go wrong, and they always do, we can have a few hours to try and fix it before our customers show up at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And then everybody is dead tired and miserable, and their families are not happy. And, it's just not a good thing, right? And so it's a big
Yeah.
source of pain for the whole team. And then I come along as the consultant and say, we should do that more often. And they just love hearing that. But the thing I did first was have them document whether or not their deployments were successful or not, and then chart that against how many days it had been since their last deployment. And
Mm.
frequently when they would deploy, let's say on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock in the morning, they'd get it mostly fixed, but there'd still be a couple little things that weren't worth everybody sticking around for because they were all exhausted. So, on Wednesday, they'd do another little deployment. And on Thursday, they might do one more. And then that was it. And then 6 or 12 weeks later would be the next deployment. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you put that into a spreadsheet and you say, well, which of these were successful, where success means we didn't have to roll it back, we didn't have to immediately fix something, right? Well,
Yeah.
that first one on Tuesday was never successful. And even the second one on
Mm-hmm.
Wednesday, you kind of wouldn't necessarily kind of successful because you had to do it again on Thursday to fix that, still things remaining. But then that Thursday one was a success because then it was good for however long, right? And so it becomes really obvious. You can chart it and say, well, look, the more days there were since the last deployment, the more likely it was to fail. So if we want to have successful deployments, we should do it more often. And so
Mm-hmm.
now that same client just has a schedule. Every Tuesday and every Thursday at lunchtime, they deploy. And it's been running smoothly for them for years now. And it's not a thing. It's no big deal, right? Nobody worries
Yeah.
about it. Families aren't complaining that people are, exhausted or not around all morning to help with, getting
Yeah.
kids to school or whatever it might be. Like it's just easy. And
Yeah.
it's almost always successful because there's only 2 days worth of work there, right? If something doesn't work, you know exactly what it was. You just worked on it.
Yep. Yeah, by shortening or taking smaller bites almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't choke on it as much. So let's say you've got a client, they're they've had some unsuccessful releases over the years and they're sort of gun shy of that. They want to
put in place some more processes and kind of slow things down. And the sort of the natural human tendency is to do those things, and it leads you to bigger releases that then are arguably more risky. So how do
Right.
you A, convince them to go in the exact opposite direction that is human nature, and then B, like what are the first steps?
I think documenting the success, like defining what success means and then documenting it,
Mm-hmm.
gives you some evidence to stand on. So it's not just my word or my experience with other companies, because then they can say, well, we're not like those other companies, right? But if you
Right.
take that team and their track record of deployment, then you chart that against some variable like frequency of deployment, and then you can show them after 3 or 6 months that, well, look, there's an obvious correlation here. Argue with that. Then it becomes much easier to make the sale, and that's basically what I did. I just let the numbers speak for themselves. If the numbers
Yeah.
had come back in a whole different way, I would have said, "Hey, what you're doing is working. Let's keep on doing
Right.
quarterly deployments." But I was pretty sure that wasn't going to be the case, and there wasn't a huge hurry for me to convince them overnight. So we were working on
Yeah.
other things while they were gathering this data, and then 6 months
Right.
later, I was like, "Hey, let's see that spreadsheet you put together." And they were the ones doing it, not me. So they pull out the spreadsheet and like, "Well, look what you collected here," and it was great. It made it easy.
Yeah.
The other thing that's related to this that you could do more of is automation and DevOps processes. A lot of the things that might be checks and things that you would do right before the release could be done on every commit, right? Do that in little tiny chunks. Like you're doing security
Mm-hmm.
scans, you're doing some types of reviews. You don't do those right before you release. You do them on every commit. You do them on every pull request, and that way, when it comes time to release, everything's already been reviewed. Everything's already known to be good. And then the last thing I would say is, try and separate releasing software from deploying software, which for a large percentage of especially web developers, those are the same thing. And when I
Mm-hmm.
talk to teams that are doing it a certain way, and I say like, do you think of these two things differently? They're like, no, those are the same. What are you talking about? They don't even understand that those could be different. And so that's something that organizations can adopt is this whole idea of continuous delivery, where you have code that you have shipped, but it's not actually available in the application yet, or you can control who has access to it through some types of flags.
That makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned DevOps, continuous integration and deployment. What anti-patterns do you see happening the most often there that are causing feedback loops to get too long or to not actually be feedback loops?
Well, I mean, you mentioned one, which was like just excessive, bureaucratic or regulatory or whatever you want to call it, hurdles into actually deploying software. So the more approval steps and checks you put in place that can't be automated or done with a metric instead of with a person making a decision, the more difficult it is. And so if you can establish that the software is has exhibits the qualities necessary for it to be ready for a release, and those are objective metrics that you can automate the verification of, then that gets you a lot closer to being able to just ship the software continuously.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. So with a lot of web software, there's not a huge cost in many organizations, especially for internal facing apps, to shipping it, and then if there's an issue, just fixing it right after. So instead of trying to release perfect software, you make sure everything is good before you ship it. Just ship it, and then if there's any issues, fix them. That doesn't work necessarily for every company, obviously, but for some lower risk internal tools, that works quite well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you see people automating things in pipelines that don't make sense or really shouldn't be in there, that are gumming up the works or moving it in the opposite direction?
I do see you have a feedback loop with the build server, assuming you have a build server, which you should.
Yeah.
And so the sooner that that your merge or your pull request or whatever is
Mm-hmm.
good on the build server, the sooner you can like get that out of your head and start really committing to the next process. Because until that comes back green, you've got this tension. It's like, all right, should I move on? Because if that's red, I'm going to have to just pull it back out and get it all set up again and fix it. And so getting that to be as fast as possible is important. There are different types of checks that you can do, and they all take different amounts of time. And so one of the things that I recommend is splitting up your tests into different types of tests, mostly based on how long they take. So unit tests are super, super fast. Run those unit tests locally, run those unit tests on the first PR. They're fast and they're going to take seconds. But some integration tests that use the database or use other infrastructure or have to spin up VMs or Docker containers to do their thing, especially in like microservice environments, those could take minutes instead of milliseconds. So You know, you might not want to do those on every build or on even every PR build. It might be that those are only done like after the PR is merged, we run those checks, or after it's been deployed to a staging environment, then we can run some checks in the staging environment to make sure everything is talking together correctly. And then things like load tests are a whole other thing. Like you almost want to have, or not almost, you definitely want to have a separate dedicated environment that you deploy to that then your load tests target. And those probably shouldn't be part of your CI/CD at all. Yeah. You might have some smaller profiler tests where you're just looking for things that suddenly take a lot longer than they used to, and you can catch those quickly. But actual like extended load test of the whole system should be in a dedicated environment and probably on a scheduled basis.
So if your whole build is taking an hour, that's not going to be really a very useful build, because that feedback cycle is going to, someone's going to check something in, and it's going to be at least an hour, maybe longer if another build is already running, before they even know that it didn't work.
Right. Depending on I like to have multiple pipelines or multiple builds. And so it's not like there's just one build and it has to do everything, right? You try and fail fast. And so what I mean by that is if a unit test is going to catch a problem, you want that unit test to be the first thing that runs and to immediately fail the build, right? Don't make your unit test be the last thing after you do all the other more expensive integration and UI tests. And so maybe when you create a pull request, it immediately compiles the code and runs the unit tests, and then says the PR looks good, it's ready for review. Somebody reviews it, it gets merged in. Now it gets a bigger test that runs, and it runs all the integration tests and everything else to make sure everything still works together in the main branch. And that may take longer. That may take 5 or 10 minutes, or an hour is a long time, but hopefully less than 15 minutes. But most of the time it should be good, because most of the scenarios your unit test should catch. This is just like those outliers that somehow you didn't catch, that your integration and UI test would catch.
I've seen environments with like a nightly build that does some more extensive, end-to-end testing or that type of thing.
Yeah. And basically the longer it takes, probably the less frequently you can and should run it, right? You don't want to block your productivity with these things, but they still can add value if they catch something before it goes out the door.
Absolutely. So the term feedback cycles, just the very words feedback, implies that you're measuring something, right? There's some metrics kind of implied in that idea. Otherwise, it's not really a cycle unless it comes back and you get a number and you can decide whether to, go around the cycle again.
And at the simplest case, it's a true false, right? It's a success or not.
Yeah, right. Like did this release succeed by our definitions? So what other metrics do you think every software team should be measuring on their projects so that they have that data on these cycles?
I don't know. It's a good question. I tend to have metrics I want for a specific reason. There's a particular experiment I'm running, or a particular hypothesis I want to validate, scientific method style. And so I need some data in order to validate whether my hypothesis is correct. And so if I'm wondering whether or not they should be trying to do more frequent builds, then I can come up with some data that might support that or not. If I'm wondering if, they had more test coverage, if that would help them have fewer, bugs coming in from customers, I could gather, data on test coverage or total tests or something, and then graph that against, how many bugs were reported last week or last month. But I wouldn't say that there's like every team everywhere should always record this data, because if you're just recording it because somebody said so on a podcast and you're not doing anything with it, then it's just a waste of time.
Yeah. And that may not be a problem for you, right? Like you may be measuring something that you don't need to make any changes on.
Yeah, exactly. So depending on why I've been called in or what their pain is, there's different things that I'm going to try and test. It's like when you go to the doctor, like they're not going to order every test just because you showed up, hopefully. But after they hear some of your symptoms, they might order specific tests that are appropriate.
Oh, I'm writing this down. I'm going to have to talk to my doctor about that.
At least in the U.S. If you have universal healthcare, you can just test whatever the heck you want, I suppose.
That's right. So maybe it's fair to say if you have a team, you're experiencing some pain, it's possible there's some metrics that you're missing, but maybe you start with what's your pain?
Right.
Turn that pain into a question, and then try and figure out what metrics will help you answer that question, start tracking those. Does that seem like a fair approach?
Yep. There's a quote I like. I forget off the top of my head whose it was. It's not me, but the idea is that if something hurts, you should do it more often. And so in your software process, if there's a part of it that's painful, like deploying, if you can do it more often, it'll be smaller chunks. So maybe it won't be as painful because it's smaller, or you'll figure out ways to automate it, or you'll do something to make it easier. And so if it's something you only do once every 6 months, there's no point in automating it. There's no point in optimizing it. And by the time you have to do it again, you've forgotten all the stuff you remembered to do last time. But if it's something you do every day, then you're going to quickly figure out a way to make it easier and faster and stuff. And then, the problem starts to disappear. The pain involved with doing a software deployment is not linear with how much code you're shipping. It's exponential, right? So if you can keep it small, you'll keep it from exploding beyond where it's going to be, a failure.
For sure. We mentioned Agile a couple of times already. Agile methodology obviously has a lot to say about quicker cycles. Kanban is like a variety of Agile that you could call sort of a continuous style of Agile versus what I think more people are maybe familiar with, which is the Scrum style of projects. So what do you see in those like Kanban style approaches or the continuous Agile style approaches? What do you see as, pluses and minuses there as far as faster feedback cycles?
Yeah, so it probably won't surprise you to hear that I'm a fan of Kanban versus Scrum, because I see Scrum as being an incremental improvement. It's like, we used to only build software every 6 months, and then we started doing monthly builds, and then we started daily builds, and then we dialed it to 11 and did continuous integration. With the iterations, like Scrum has, it's, we're going to put it down to 2 weeks and never get any better than that. Like, no, we could make that faster too, right? And some of the ceremonies that Scrum has that they tie to a sprint don't necessarily have to be tied to the same time frame. For instance, you're supposed to do a retrospective after a sprint. You're supposed to do a demo after a sprint. You're supposed to do, various other ceremonies that are involved that all have to have the same time frame. Like, no, you could do a retrospective every 3 weeks if that's what works for you. And you could do customer demos every Tuesday and Thursday with whatever you just got done, like whatever works for you. Or they don't even have to be on a calendar schedule. You could do a customer demo every time a feature gets completed. Like, it depends, right? If your customer is right there with you and it's cheap to say, hey, look at this, or you do a screen share and you just put it somewhere where they can get to it. Like, look, that was your demo. Like, point them at that URL, demo, done.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to have a meeting, right? It's, a lot of the overhead on Scrum is these meetings that just take up a lot of time. And those meetings are expensive. If you think about the developer rates and how many developers are sitting in these meetings every week for these different Agile processes, I think Kanban does a lot to streamline that. And the idea is that you do still need to do some of these, regular cadence things, but you can decide what cadence works best for your team and adjust it as you need to, because that's Agile.
Yeah. You mentioned retros. That's a common way that Scrum type of Agile projects will do kind of a feedback cycle at the end of the sprint. Mm-hmm. How do you work something like that into more of a continuous Agile process?
We always just schedule them, right? We would do it like once a month. We'd have a retrospective for the team and see what went well, what didn't go well, what do we want to try. Pick one or two high priority things and say, these are new things we're going to try, and we'll revisit those next month and see if things got better. Right? Make note of the things that we bought into that we as a team or even with management buy-in are going to try and improve, and then see if those things are better or worse at the next one, and then pick different ones or continue pushing on the existing priorities. But
so at its core, the retro is basically asking you to regularly check in, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you did a release yesterday or if you finished your sprint yesterday or something. Although those are good times, I imagine, right?
Yeah, they can be, because in the cycle of Scrum, between sprints, there's like this time when you take a breath and, reevaluate and things. And there can be some value in that, but you can build those into a calendar as well, or you can build those into a release cycle as well, based solely on how many stories you got done or whatever it might be, right? Those don't have to necessarily coincide with a quote unquote sprint. I hear feedback from people that don't like Kanban because it's like, well, I feel like it's an unending treadmill of never having a break. And, but then on the other hand, like if you look at Scrum, it's nothing but sprints. Like, who runs a marathon is nothing but sprints. That's not sustainable either. Right. Just using nomenclature. I know that's not really what they do, but there's nothing in Kanban that says you can't pause or take a break or do a retrospective or just have your 20% time to work on other things or whatever it might be. Like, it's literally as flexible as you want to make it. So it's a very agile framework from that perspective, because it's not as prescriptive as other approaches like Scrum.
Yeah. All right. So let's say someone's listening to this conversation. They're tuning in to everything that you're saying, totally resonating with it. They have all of these problems on their team. Where do they start?
Well, they should call you or me, and we'll come charge them some money and fix all the things. No, there's some excellent resources, books, and other things that you can read. There's a great book on Kanban that's literally just called Kanban, that talks about teams from Microsoft and how they went from being one of the worst effective teams to one of the best effective teams, simply by switching over to using a Kanban style approach. And one of the things that they did as part of that was they reduced how they were doing estimating. Because estimating is one of those things where you're guessing at the future, and it has a very short shelf life, and it has very limited value if the estimate is wrong, and most estimates are wrong. So if you do certain things, like you just say, you know what, on average, our tasks take us a day to do or 2 days to do or whatever, then you could just say, well, we've got 10 tasks. They probably are going to take 10 days or 20 days or whatever your average is, right? And you don't have to estimate them, right? You can just check the average when you're done and say, if you keep track of the average, then you know what it is, and you get the same ability to estimate as you did if you were actually estimating, except you didn't have to spend all that time doing the estimates. So like apply some statistics to it. So that book is huge. That book really sells Kanban, I think, as an approach. Lean Software Development by Mary Poppendieck is excellent. Folks should read that. It's got a bunch of good principles in it. And there's a whole lot more, but those are a couple of places I would start just to talk about project management styles and delivery methodology. Other things like automation, the DevOps books are good. Phoenix Project, and some similar ones by those authors. Unicorn, and I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there's a bunch of good DevOps books out there too that will help you with this stuff.
For the rest of the list, just Google best DevOps books. Right?
That's right.
Those are great recommendations. I enjoy many of those as well. We like to focus on how to improve software projects on this podcast. It's so hard. The statistics indicate that something like half of software projects fail in some capacity. I don't think that's really improved over time. I think we've added abstraction layers, but they're still just as difficult, even though the tooling helps us with the lower layers. So we've talked today about feedback cycles. I always like to ask this last question to every guest. What other topics should we be covering on this podcast? And is there someone that we should be talking to about that topic? What's the podcast that you would tune into? What topics should we cover there?
Well, I think software methodology could be a big one. A lot of the folks that signed the Agile Manifesto are still with us and around, and might accept an invitation for the podcast. Mary Poppendieck is retired, but I think might be willing to come and chat with you for a little bit and share some of her great experience. Software architecture is another topic where if you get the architecture wrong, it's likely to cause a lot of pain further on down the road. So anyone that wants to talk about different architecture and architecture trade-offs and how to make the right decisions about that would certainly be something I'd be interested in. It's a lot of what I'm thinking about these days. Practical design patterns would be another one. Sometimes there's certain design patterns that solve a certain type of pain that until you see it, until you know that exists, you just think that the pain is just the way it is, right? Okay. And then suddenly someone pulls the wool away from your eyes. And you're like, oh, I can see, this thing suddenly fixes all these other problems I was having. And people can overuse design patterns and misuse design patterns like anything, but I think they can be something that helps build better software. And they sometimes get a bad rap of being overly complicating. Usually that's when they're misused. When they're used well, it ends up with an elegant, simpler solution with less cut and paste code everywhere that is, to me, much, much more enjoyable to work with. One of the folks that I work with, both professionally and in my open source stuff, is a developer whose name is Fadi Esseni. He'd be a great person to have on your podcast. He's got a lot of great ideas around architecture and other stuff. So he'd be another one that I could recommend if you were looking for guests.
Yeah, those are all great recommendations. Those are conversations I hope we do get to have on the podcast here. And maybe I'll have to even invite you back for one or two of those in the future.
All right,
Steve.
Anytime.
Thanks so much for your time and your wisdom and insight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay. It was fun.
That's the end of This Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.